Alright, so I've looked over this waveform pretty much in different areas, in the idle point and the rev up point, which is going to be in these areas where the ignition gets close together, and this was decel, where ignition splits apart. And I'm not seeing much of a change in what's called fluctuation of the cam signals. And so what I'm talking about is the crank is here in the blue, that's ignition, so cylinder 1. And then we've got what I believe are the 2 intake cams in green, yellow, and then the 2 exhausts in purple and gray. Now the gray seems to be a little advanced, let's call it, but that is going to be supposedly exhaust bank 1, but as far as the trouble code, let's call it quote unquote, it's going to be for bank 1 intake 1, which is going to be the yellow. And I was wanting to see if it really veered off in a big difference from the bank 2 intake. Now this engine is one of those where bank to bank intakes and exhausts will overlay, meaning the cam waveform pattern teeth will basically be on top of each other, be the same or mirror each other, which is what I call the overlay, and then the exhaust will do the same. And so that helps us to try to identify if one seems to be walking or a signal is different from the other bank. And right now I'm not seeing anything in the idle, in the rev up portion, or anything. So here is another spot. I think this was the decel, but again, I'm not seeing something or anything that jumps out that is conclusive for me to make some sort of call. This was at startup. Let's see how they look here. So even here, nothing that veers off big time. This is at first crank up. So the engine's first turning over after firing up, so on and so forth, gaining some speed and no great variance. And so it was the same at cranking. The waveform was the same bank to bank. I can put up a picture of it. So right now, so far, I've done crank no start, checking the cam and crank and cam to cams, bank to bank, so on and so forth. The same at startup, idle, and rev up. I'm not seeing anything that can potentially bring us to the trouble code that we're getting. And so what I want to do next is put it through its paces and activate the variable cam timing. And so that is what I'm set up for now. This is going to be at idle, and we will apply voltage to the oil control valves for both intake banks at the same time. I've got this harness that I've made, and so they're plugged into each bank's intake control, solenoid control, and I've added an amp clamp so that on the waveform we can tell the activation point by grabbing the signal here when I ground this end. This one is supplied power, and so I'll just tap this to ground and get the cams to move. And then I want to check bank to bank if we get the same amount of movement from bank 1 as the supposed good bank, which is bank 2. So that's my next step. I'm trying to get something to default so that way I know where I'm going before I'm opening up this engine. Meaning, do I throw everything at it, or is there something specific that we can pick out so that we know what to address when we open it up? That is why I'm doing all this testing.
So the other main reason why I am trying to test to see what we're going to need and only need is because the customer decided to not put that much money into it was because basically when I presented the customer with a full estimate of replacing all the timing components, since we're going to be in there, he was starting to kind of, let's call it complain. And so I told him I can just figure out exactly what has failed and replace just what has failed. But then obviously there's no guarantee on anything else. And we've all dealt with those type of customers. And at this point, I'm going to figure out what's wrong and just replace what's wrong.
And if any of you care, this is my setup. So this is my scope channels and color. This is my pierce probes here, and then where they go to. So ignition 1, crank, and then the sensors, the way that Dodge or whatever labels them is 2, 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 1, 2, the pins and color, so on and so forth. That is where I'm tapped in for all these signals. And fun fact, this connector here is one that I got from BMW N20, N55 injector connectors. It is the same exact connector for the fuel injectors on the BMW. The high pressure fuel injectors on BMWs is the same exact connector, the internal piece at least, this guy, as the fuel injector. So that's how it got lucky and was able to make a harness for that. Alright guys, so here we've got the waveform that we just recorded with the oil control valve activation. That's going to be up here up top. The amp clamp, when you see activity there, that is when I grounded the wire, and then we were supposed to get some activation. And so we are going to take a look at our camshafts. And I got this marked out so that we have an idea as far as where the amp clamp had some activity. And then, so if we take a look, like what we were saying, these are both still overlaid when there is activity from the solenoids. Both are looking to be about the same, so if both are moving and moving the same, they would probably still overlay each other, which doesn't make sense based off the code. Just out of curiosity, if we take a look down at the bottom, and wow. Alright, so a couple issues going on. Well, I think we found our problem. Secondly, I think I was this whole time referring to the wrong camshafts based off of the pinout stuff that I gathered. Now, all this will have to be double checked, or this has to be clarified. I've never really understood, and it's always been difficult to break down the designation or nomenclature of what Chrysler's trying to do with their 2111, 2212. Normally, I would have thought bank 1, cam 1 usually is referred to as intake, 2 would be exhaust. So I would think bank 1, cam 2, which would be exhaust cam. But right now, the way we're looking so gray is down at the bottom, and then purple is also down at the bottom, and those two were overlaying. So bank 1, bank 2, and cams 2 per bank were the ones that were overlaying the bottom, purple and gray. And if we take a look, this again marks our point of activation or activity right here. So let's get a zoom in. Actually, just before then, let's start off over here. Now, I don't like using the gray, especially if I'm trying to bring this to you guys, because gray doesn't always come out that great on camera. But with so many channels that I was running and all the cams, I kept it in order, and I had to use the gray and not skip around. So that's neither here or there. Let's take a look at this point, this small tooth and small tooth. They're overlaid. And then if we start moving this way, as we graft out more, you can already tell right here, this tooth on the purple moved to the left and the gray stayed. Right there, you can tell. And then this small tooth is already way over compared to the gray tooth right there. So our purple is starting to shift to the left, which on the scope screen, when anything shifts over to the left, it means it's being advanced. And we know that we are powering up two solenoids, both on the intake cams, and if these two were overlaying each other fine and dandy before, and they're splitting apart right now, then these have to be our intake cams first and foremost, because they overlaid each other, and because we're moving one of them. And so we have a trouble code for one not working, or a slow response, I think is the description, and one of them is not moving, which could equate to a slow response trouble code. So I think we've got it figured out here on the scope, and it's not a full out of time, out of sync, or cam crank correlation, because all four cams, cranking and idle, overlay each other. They're fine. They're not mismatching each other for the most part. Where we're having an issue is when we are commanding or demanding movement of the intake cams, and bank 1 is not moving compared to bank 2. And here's the proof. And if we back out, let's go full out screen, and let's go towards the end where I definitely was not applying or supplying voltage. And we're pretty much back to where we were, sort of overlaying each other, or at least for the most part. Now, that makes sense, because earlier the purple I was noticing had a little bit of difference there, maybe, but not enough to justify that something's totally out of place. But for now, with no activation, the purple has shifted back over to the right, and now these are pretty much close enough to being called that they are overlaying. That's why we're not getting a cam crank correlation code, because that overlay for all four cams is close enough and good enough to call that in time and correct cam crank correlation for all four cams. And so we're having an issue when variable cam timing activation is requested on the intake cam for movement of bank 1. Now I'd like to try one more last thing. I'm going to run and activate the exhaust oil control valve. Start this capture. All right, so now let's take a look at that. And we want to see movement on the what now we know is exhaust, which should be green and yellow. First and foremost, I want to make sure we have nothing crazy going on. So I make sure nothing changes down there with the purple and gray. That's just helping verify what we seem to be finding. And then just like before, when I thought we were doing the intakes and the green and yellow were still overlaying, I was assuming that both were moving the same amount. That seems to be the case because they're not veering too bad. They're still sort of overlaying. We know we activated. Let's see. So from this point to that point. So if they're both moving and they're moving the same, then we won't be able to tell or reference if they're moving. We will have to go up against the crank and compare. So it looks like this can be a good measurable point. So the small tooth right here and right here, they line up with the sync notch on the crank signal. So right now I'm looking at it where we did not have activation, and so if these two small teeth move over to, actually the exhaust should go to the right. So if they move off of the sync gap, let's call it, then we know we have movement. So let's take a look here. So at this point, let's see, our solenoid. So right here we should still be lined up, and we are. Small tooth and gap. Let's go. Let's cross the line. Let's go a cycle over. And right away, look, we are beginning to have movement. So sync gap, and these guys are moving over to the right. One looks like it's leading the other, but we are not having trouble codes for the exhaust. But we have identified our cams for sure, 100%, which we knew beforehand because of our intake activation. So our exhaust phasers, and here we go, way good movement there at that point. So we have now fully identified the problem of what's going on with this engine. It is not out of time from top to bottom. It's not out of time from bank to bank. It'll start and run and idle still good and in time. But when we drive, which it makes sense, this has like low power when accelerating or trying to drive. That is when we're trying to do phasing. Our intake for this bank does not phase like this bank. Our exhaust for both, they phase, they move, they're good. Our intake for this one phases and moves, it's good. we have one problem. We've identified that most likely that phaser gear is what is causing our problem. So we have now narrowed everything down to 99% one particular item. And I say that because we still have to have good oil flow, so on and so forth, to move the gear. But with everything that we've just now done, we've been able to identify, just with a scope and not opening up the engine, what we have going on.
Now, I have done some timing work on 3.6 before, but I don't get them too often, and I totally forgot about the whole rocker camshaft issue. And to my surprise, or not, when I opened this up to replace the gear, I happened to find that that same bank intake cam had the lobes chewed up. And so at this point, despite the fact the owner was trying to be frugal, we had to also get a new camshaft and rockers and lifters and so on. And here you can see the new components that we're going to go in. And then the next shot, we've got the picture of the new oil control valve that secures the camshaft phaser. And I opted to not use it and stick with the old one, which I wasn't too happy about. But you can tell that the manufacturing process of these new parts still nowadays is not great. So I opted to not use it.
Alright guys, so clearly I'm driving the vehicle now. I did not get any shots of it cranking up. Obviously did not scope it. I am a little pressed for time, being that I had to get the camshaft, which delayed it just a little bit. So I'm just trying to get this over and done with and moved on. But I just took it out, I'll say roughly about 10 miles. All different RPM and speeds. So I've run the camshaft phasing, I would assume, through its paces, let's call it. Meaning it's done adjustments in both directions, let's hope. And no issues, no codes, no drivability issues like before, where it would lose power or be down on power. Alright guys, so there's the main culprit that we decided to do. There's the rest that we found. I've driven it for about 10 miles now, and no check engine, nothing crazy, full power, acceleration, seems to drive good, no misfires, nothing. I'm quickly gonna hook up and look at a crank no start. I want to see if the RC changes. So
the reason why I want to look at the RC is because of what the intake camshaft looked like. After seeing that, after tearing it open, I wanted to get a view if the RC looked different. And so this is the capture of before fixing anything, and it was a cranking no start, clearly, since we have RC present. And I didn't even look at it in depth before, since I was concentrating mostly on just the camshaft issue, trying to find a problem there. But we can see that we have uneven humps created in the relative compression, and it's one after the other, and that is a difference in bank-to-bank compression, it looks like. Well, clearly it is. But the odd thing is I am synced on coil number 1, and the firing order is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, back to 1. For some reason, with that worn out camshaft, we are looking like it is having higher compression on bank 1. And at least it's definitely making a difference from bank to bank. when doing the cranking. So there is a mechanical difference there that I did not even pick up earlier when doing the testing that I was doing. All right, and so this is the capture of taking the crank nose start after all the repairs. And I had to use basically voltage drop because my amp clamp was messing up. But we can clearly see now that our relative compression humps have now evened up. They are reaching the same levels, top to bottom, peaks and valleys, as or different compared to before. So that camshaft on that one bank was making that difference, and for some reason, without going too deep into trying to figure it out, it was making that bank have or look like it was having higher compression. But now all are level, and so we are all good mechanically, breathing wise, camshaft wise, bank to bank. And so now we're going to use this scope capture to see what is going on because we now have that new trouble code. So again, our intakes are going to be at the bottom. They are the gray and purple. So let's move some of these guys up out the way. Let's bring the crank down just in case we need a reference. So you can tell here this down at the bottom, that is when I activated the solenoid right here at this point. So that's where we're going to look for movement. And so let's go here right away. So bank one is the gray, it's down at the bottom. And if we take a look, so when we can see what's going on. So all right, the gray, let's look at this section right here. So the gray is to the left more of the purple. Before, the purple was more to the left than the gray, but that was because the purple was moving. And so now our gray is the new phaser. It is moving and moving way further than the purple. We know the purple moves because we saw it move. So this makes me think that because in the beginning, bank one, this gray channel here, cam, did not move at all, but computer saw purple bank two move, it derived the trouble code for slow movement, basically because of no movement, compared to bank one, compared to bank two, which then obviously threw the code for bank one. Now it is seeing basically the opposite, despite the fact that we are actually getting movement for bank two here in the purple, but because it is not as fast or hitting other targets as fast as bank one, we are now deriving a code for bank two. I initially was mentally thinking that the code was derived based off a computer expecting to hit a certain degree movement based off a duty cycle pulse width of the oil control solenoid valve. I'm now just beginning to wonder if it's not that way and it just watches the speed movement. because why would it not throw a code for number 2 intake not hitting a certain degree based off of a certain duty cycle? It's acting the same as it was before, but before it would not throw a trouble code, which it must not be hitting a certain degree based off a certain duty cycle, because we know it's moving slowly or slower than what it should if it's new. So I'm wondering if it's just watching the speed and it hopes to see both move the same speed, and so it assumes it's hitting its degree movement point based off duty cycle as opposed to hitting a degree target. I think that's what we're seeing here. The fact that it is moving but not moving fast enough compared to the new one, and now it's being called a faulty one. That's kind of crazy. Um, it's crazy that it passed before, but now that another one's faster, now it's considered not fast, and, and it throws the light. It's just mind-boggling that the computer is only programmed to watch the speed and not a degree target. So there you go. I guess this is what being frugal gets you, possibly. Um, this is why I would have wanted to do everything all at once, but I don't know. Maybe it makes a good learning experience here on YouTube also for you guys. And again, all of this is able to be proven out with the scope.